Let's begin the bulletin in Syria, where Turkish drone strikes have killed 19 government soldiers in the northwestern Idlib province. This comes after Turkish forces destroyed 2 Syrian government jets in Idlib yesterday and confirmed a full-scale military operation. A Syrian war monitor says the strikes hit a military convoy in the Jabal al-Zawiya area and a base near the town of Ma'arit al-Numan. Tensions in the region have escalated in the recent days after 34 Turkish troops were killed in government air raids on Idlib. The confrontations have added to soaring tensions between Turkey and Russia, which both support opposing sides of the Syrian civil war. The Kremlin said President Vladimir Putin and his Turkish counterpart Tayyip Erdogan will meet in Moscow on March 5th to discuss Syria. Well, in a related development, the EU has called an extraordinary meeting of its Foreign Affairs Council next week to discuss the continuing developments in Idlib. In a statement, the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, said renewed fighting in Idlib is a serious threat to international peace and security. Borrell said the fighting is causing untold human suffering in the population, besides its grave impact on the region. He said the Foreign Affairs Council meeting was called for at the request of the Greek foreign minister. Borrell said the EU must redouble efforts to address the terrible human crisis. The top diplomat said the Syrian regime must urgently re-engage in a political process under the auspices of the UN. Tensions in Idlib escalated sharply last week when 34 Turkish soldiers were killed in an airstrike. Well, the Syrian government and Libya's Khalifa Haftar have agreed to exchange diplomatic missions and confront Turkey. A delegation from Haftar met Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim in Damascus. Syrian state media said a memorandum of understanding has been signed to reopen diplomatic and consular missions. Muallim said missions will be reopened in Damascus and the eastern city of Benghazi, controlled by Haftar. The two sides pledged to coordinate efforts to confront Turkey, which supports the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. The agreement comes as tensions have spiraled between the Syrian regime and Turkish forces in Idlib, where bombardments have killed dozens of troops on each side. Libya has had no representation in Damascus since 2012, after the killing of former dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Ankara says over 80,000 migrants have so far crossed into Europe from Turkey's northwestern borders. The Turkish presidency's communications director, Ferhattin Altun, says the number may increase due to unprecedented displacement in Syria. The presidency says Syria's migration challenge is not only Turkey's problem, but that of the region, Europe, and the entire world. After Turkey announced it will no longer stop migrants from going to Europe, thousands of refugees gathered near the Pazarkule border gate. Meanwhile, Greece has blocked any new asylum applications for the next month following Ankara's decision. Greek officials said they have stopped nearly 10,000 migrants crossing the land border with Turkey.
The National Security Council, which met today, has decided on the following. Firstly, the guarding of the country's eastern land and sea borders by the armed and security forces has been upgraded to the highest level in order to prevent illegal entry into the country. Secondly, the temporary suspension of all asylum applications from today and for 1 month for all those who entered the country illegally.
Iraq's Prime Minister-designate Mohammed Allawi has withdrawn his candidacy for the post and has accused political parties of obstructing him. Parliament has refused for the second time in a week to approve Allawi's cabinet. The rejection comes against a background of political infighting, deepening domestic crisis, and an unprecedented power vacuum. Since October, mass protests are underway in Iraq against the country's political system, which is deemed corrupt. Allawi said he took his decision because some political factions were not serious about reform or fulfilling their pledges to the people.
I tried by all possible means to save Iraq from drifting to the unknown and to solve the current crisis. But during negotiations, I faced many matters. I faced many things that are irrelevant to the issue of the homeland and its interest. I swear to God, I didn't surrender and I didn't put my own interest above the country's ones. Regrettably, some parties were negotiating only for getting their interest without paying heed to the national issue and without any consideration to the blood of martyrs.
Well, President Barham Saleh has said he has started consultations to name a replacement within the constitutional timeframe. Well, Israelis are voting in the country's third general election in less than a year as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fights for his political survival. After two failed attempts to form a government, the country has been plunged into political chaos, being led by an interim administration. Two previous rounds of voting, one last April and a second in September, could not break the deadlock. This report has the details.
In a bid to reclaim power, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is once again facing off against his former Army Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz. Charged with bribery, breach of trust and fraud, Netanyahu has been in office from 1996 to 1999 and again from 2009 onwards. Polls suggest neither side will have enough seats in Israel's parliament to end the crisis, and the country may be dragged into yet another months-long election cycle regardless.
Do you see this? This is the truth. Gantz cannot achieve a government without Tibi. He can't. This is a fact. It's a mathematical fact, not some other fact. This is the truth. And people try to hide this truth. And I ask you to tell this truth. Because what's at stake is huge. We are within touching distance from a great victory.
Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party and Gantz's centrist Blue and White party are the main contenders. Hoping to dislodge Netanyahu in the election, Gantz has based his entire election campaign on Netanyahu's corruption indictment and a call to form a secular government.
We want to form a unity government based on secular parties like Kahol Lavan, Likud, Israel Betenu, maybe Labour. But from there on, we have the principles, we have the outlines, we have the framework. Everybody will be welcome to join us.
No single party has ever won an outright majority in an Israeli election. If Gantz-led Blue and White edges out Likud, it will require support from other lawmakers to form a government.
Now, demonstrators in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, have taken to the streets to protest against alleged government corruption. Protesters marched towards parliament wearing protective masks after Lebanon confirmed 3 new coronavirus cases. The government had frozen recruitment, but at the time of a key election, thousands of people suddenly received civil service jobs. The alleged corruption case is just one of many causing public anger in Lebanon. Protesters want an end to the rampant graft they say has brought the economy to its knees. Lebanese have been angrily voicing their complaints in waves of mass protests since last October. Authorities say they are determined to root out corruption. Elsewhere, North Korea has fired 2 unidentified projectiles into its eastern sea to resume weapons demonstrations after a month-long break. State media said leader Kim Jong-un also supervised an artillery drill to test the combat readiness of units in frontline and eastern areas. In a statement, South Korea's military said the 2 devices were fired over the sea from the Wonsan area on the east coast. The statement said the South's military is monitoring for additional launches and is maintaining readiness. The move comes as nuclear negotiations with the U.S. are at a standstill. Kim has vowed to boost Pyongyang's nuclear deterrence in response to the U.S. sanctions and pressure. Well, over 3,000 people around the world have died from the new coronavirus, while over 60 countries have been affected. China, meanwhile, has recorded its lowest number of new infections over 24 hours, but in Italy, the total has jumped 50% in a day, rising to nearly 1,700. More in this report.
As the progress of coronavirus in China has slowed, the rest of the world has seen a sharp increase in infections. France now has 130 coronavirus cases, which means it has the second highest number of cases in Europe after Italy. But the health authorities in Paris say there is no need for drastic measures.
So I believe that today there are no drastic measures to be taken, and we will take the measures as and when they are appropriate to the situation. However, we are not currently taking such measures, such as the closure of large establishments, since the epidemiological situation does not require it. We must therefore assure our fellow citizens, reassure the people who work.
The US has reported its second coronavirus death, despite President Donald Trump's claim that the country was prepared for the outbreak. Meanwhile, South Korea is still struggling to contain the epidemic, with its case total rising to over 4,000.
The worst case scenario would be discovering more confirmed cases. I can't say if that would happen, but the hope is that we can diagnose people as soon as possible and get the situation under control.
The World Health Organization has asked countries to stock up on ventilators, saying oxygen therapy is a major treatment intervention for coronavirus patients.
Well, in Afghanistan, President Ashraf Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah Abdullah have voiced differences over the formation of a negotiating team for talks with the Taliban. In the US-Taliban Doha deal, the intra-Afghan talks must begin by March 10th. Speaking to media in Kabul, Ghani said the group should not have more than 8 members because it could create a team within a team. Abdullah accused the presidential palace of monopolizing the peace process by sending a secret delegation to Doha. The chief executive said it was this issue that led to the absence of a large number of Afghan politicians at the signing ceremony. Meanwhile, the Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen says the group is ready for the intra-Afghan talks and to fulfill its commitments. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he is hopeful inter-Afghan talk or negotiations will start soon. He said President Donald Trump will be actively engaged, but gave no details on a possible meeting. In an interview, Pompeo said the agreement is historic and contains detailed commitments by the Taliban to reduce violence. He said it will open the way for negotiations among the Afghan people on the future of their country for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, in a tweet, Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani said Trump congratulated him on the important developments in the evolving peace process. Earlier, President Trump had said he would be personally meeting Taliban leaders in the near future. Well, Pakistan says any reservations Kabul has with Islamabad should be resolved bilaterally rather than involving the U.S. In an interview, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi spoke about the Doha deal clause of the U.S. facilitating talks between the two states. Qureshi said a trust deficit between the two countries has existed and Pakistan has done its best to bridge this gap. Discussing the Doha agreement, he said the deal will never have happened without Pakistan's role and emphasis on a political solution. The Foreign Minister said Afghanistan should talk directly to Pakistan, as the U.S. is planning to withdraw and the two neighbors will always remain as such.
So a direct approach should be given preference to. If I have an issue with Afghanistan, I will not ask Washington to play a role. I will speak to Kabul directly.
Let's now get to some other news. The death toll in riots during citizenship law protests in India's capital, New Delhi, has risen to 46. Police said 3 more bodies were recovered from the violence-hit northeast part of the city. Officials claim the situation was under control, but the huge deployment of police and paramilitary remain in the affected parts. The violence left a trail of damage in the northeastern parts of the city after rioters torched vehicles, vandalized shops, and burnt buildings. Many Muslims have left their homes in the affected areas and have taken refuge in shelters set up by the government. Over 350 have been wounded after Hindu radicals targeted mosques, Muslim homes and shops under the nose of the ruling BJP government. So far, the violence against the controversial citizenship law has killed over 70 people across India. Remaining on topic, over 350 academics from around the world have signed a strongly worded statement against the riots in the Indian capital, New Delhi. In a joint statement, the academics blamed the fascist upper caste Hindutva forces for the deaths during the clashes. The academics called the violence an anti-Muslim program with eerily familiar to the RSS modus operandi in the Gujarat riots. They said there is a difference between the violence of these fanatical mobs and attempts made to defend one's life, family, and home. Authors also recalled the violence following a spate of attacks on students in Jamia, AMU, and JNU. They accused Delhi police of being complicit in the violence and acting in near-perfect coordination with the right-wing mobs. Meanwhile, protests against the riots were held in 16 European cities, including Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and Glasgow. In another effort to distort history, India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party wants to rename 2 more cities to Hindu names. In 2018, the BJP ruled Uttar Pradesh state changed the name of Allahabad city to Prayagraj and Mughal Sarai Junction to Upadhyaya. In Maharashtra, BJP has asked the state government to rename the city of Aurangabad as Sambhajinagar, a Maratha king. The BJP state president Chandrakant Patel said Hindus are descendants of Sambhaji Maharaj and not of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. Meanwhile, a BJP office bearer in Uttar Pradesh has sought to change the name of Ghazipur district to Ghadipuri. The news continues after this break. Stay tuned. Begin this segment of the Bulletin in the U.S., where in the Democratic presidential primary, former Indiana Mayor Peter Buttigieg has dropped out of the race after a poor showing in South Carolina. Buttigieg's decision came ahead of this week's Super Tuesday, when 14 states will vote in the Democratic primaries. Buttigieg said he will do everything in his power to ensure a Democratic win in November's election. He has served as the mayor of Indiana City between 2012 and January this year, and has also served as a U.S. Navy intelligence officer. After finishing a distant 3rd in the Nevada caucuses, Buttigieg came in 4th on Saturday in South Carolina, winning support from just 3% of voters.
One of those values is truth, and today is a moment of truth. After a year of going everywhere, meeting everyone, defying every expectation, seeking every vote, the truth is that the path has narrowed to a close for our candidacy, if not for our cause. And another of those values is responsibility.
On to the UK now, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has vowed to drive a hard bargain with the US in post-Brexit trade talks. London will set out its negotiating position today. Johnson said the transatlantic trade deal will reflect the uniqueness between the UK and the EU, aimed at reaching a trade agreement, will formally kick off in Brussels today. Australian summers are now effectively twice as long as its winters. Research released in the wake of that country's unprecedented fire season shows climate change has increased temperatures since the middle of the last century. This report has the details.
In the last 20 years, summer across most of Australia has been on average 1 month longer than half a century ago. At the same time, winter has contracted by an average of 3 weeks. A report by the Australia Institute, a Canberra-based think tank, has compared data from the past 2 decades with mid-20th century temperature benchmarks.
This summer, as we once knew it, is occurring much earlier than December and is finishing much later than February. On average across Australia, summer is now 31 days longer. And this, in a sense, is just one way of presenting what climate change, what climate impacts actually look like on a cultural level.
Scientists have warned increased temperatures and heat waves will create more dangerous fire seasons and severe weather events.
So in addition to getting longer, they're also getting hotter, and with that comes some serious consequences around extreme heat. If we recall, extreme heat is already the largest killer of Australians of all natural hazards. In fact, it takes out more Australians than all of the natural hazards put together.
The report was released as Australia counts the cost of a devastating and lengthy bushfire season. It burned nearly 12 million hectares of bushland, killed 33 people, and an estimated 1 billion native animals.
Asian markets are trading higher, recovering last week's losses as investors pin their hopes on a coordinated global monetary policy stimulus. Regional stocks have bucked up the trend as investors kicked off a fresh rally. The Shanghai Composite is leading regional gains, trading over 3% higher. The Nikkei 225 has gained over 1%. Seoul's Kospi and Hong Kong's Hang Seng are trading nearly 1% higher. Meanwhile, international benchmark crude oil prices have surged over 3%. Last week, Brent crude recorded its biggest weekly decline in 4 years after coronavirus fears continued to weaken global oil demands. And there you have it. You're all caught up now. For the latest updates on these and other stories, though, you can follow us on our social media at Indus.news. Thank you for watching this bulletin here on Indus News.